Welcome to Doc Secret, the show where we uncover the playbooks, strategies, and stories behind the most successful dental and medical practice owners and the companies that serve them. This show is all about building the best practice. Whether you're a dental or medical student dreaming of private practice, a seasoned doctor looking to grow or sell, or an investor exploring the healthcare space, this podcast is for you. I'm your host, Kevin Carl, and in today's episode, we're diving into the world of fraud and embezzlement in the dental industry. An uncomfortable topic for some, this episode sheds light on the problem few suspect and offers practical advice on how to tackle the challenge with confidence. More importantly, we'll cover some tips, insights, and secrets as to how to protect your practice and identify when to call in the experts. Let's get started. Welcome to Doc Secret. Joining me today is Mr. David Harris. David is the founder of Prosperident. Founded in 1989, Prosperident is the world's oldest and largest dental embezzlement investigation firm. David is a certified forensic accountant and holds multiple additional certifications such as Certified Fraud Examiner, Certified Public Accountant, and Licensed Private Investigator. David is also the author of 2 books, Dental Embezzlement, The Art of Theft and the Science of Control, and his most recent book entitled Healers versus Stealers, How to Outsmart the Thief in Your Dental Practice. David, welcome to the program.
Oh, so good to be with you, Kevin.
Well, David, let's jump right in. You've worn many hats: CPA, private investigator, Canadian Army officer, Mensa member, to name a few. How did you end up becoming dentistry's go-to fraud expert?
I would like to say that I had a master plan and I followed it. That wasn't it at all. I got kicked out of high school. I joined the Army because it sounded better than my other choice that day, which was jail. When I got a uniform on, things went far better than I expected, and probably far better than the Army expected, and I got promoted fairly quickly, and eventually was commissioned as an officer. When my enlistment was up, I grew my hair long like now. I became a civilian. I ended up working for a bank as an investigator. It didn't last very long. The bank I worked with was terminally stupid, and they just insisted on making the same mistakes over and over. So I quit my job. This was 1989, Kevin, just to give you the chronology. Moved back to my hometown. I had been here for about 2 weeks and was starting to climb the walls with boredom when my phone rang, and it was a guy I'd been in high school with in my quick trip there, who was now a dentist. And he said, "I think my front desk person is stealing from me, and David, I don't have anyone else to call." So his timing was splendid. This was August. There was nothing good on TV. And I said to my friend, "No problem. I'll meet you tonight at work after you close and we'll get to the bottom of it." So I went to his office that night. Now, this was 1989 BC, in other words, before computers. So in those days, there was an old system called Pegboard that was kind of the antecedent of practice management software. And in Pegboard, what each patient owed the practice was captured on a ledger card, and they sat in this tray. So I got to his office and he shoved the tray of ledger cards at me and said, "I think you should look in there." And I said, "No, we're going to do this a little bit differently. Show me where she works." So my friend took me to her desk and I started going through the drawers. And now my friend was kind of going bug-eyed, like, "Are you going to get me in prison for this? Like, aren't we invading her privacy?" And I took him off the hook and I said, "Well, actually, it's your desk. She just works there." What I found, Kevin, taped under one of her drawers was what we call in the trade her cheat book. So this is where a thief keeps track of what they've done so they know what's real and what's not real in the accounts. And now it's more likely to be an Excel spreadsheet, but in 1989, it was an old-fashioned notebook, and that's what I found.
Amazing.
And when I had that in my hand, the whole thing came unraveled pretty quickly. Within a couple of hours, we had a pretty clear picture of what had happened. And at that point, my friend decided to ask me for one more favor. He said, could you come back tomorrow morning because I'm going to fire her and I'd rather not deal with that by myself. Okay, the chance of me being otherwise bored tomorrow morning is about 100%. So, of course, I'll come back. So we fired her. It was over and done probably within 10 or 15 minutes. And my friend promised to buy me dinner that I'll mention I'm still waiting for. And I just kind of walked away and shrugged my shoulders. I didn't really see a career path for myself. Well, 2 weeks later, everything changed. And what happened was I had an appointment in my own dentist's office. And imagine for a minute the jolt of lightning I got when I had my hand on the front door and I was about to go in and I looked through the glass panel in the front door and sitting at his front desk was the same woman I fired 2 weeks ago. What I said next, I will not repeat. I spun around. I ran to a payphone because in 1989, you didn't carry a cell phone around. And I called the practice and I used a little bit of deception to get past her and get my dentist on the phone. And once I did that, I told him about the time bomb that was ticking away loudly at his front desk, and he panicked and hired me, and that was my first client.
Wow.
And by the time I finished his work, the local Henry Schein rep realized what I was doing, and he had a couple of other clients that he was concerned about. So suddenly, I was in business.
Yeah. Well, David, I know Prosperident is now the oldest and largest firm in this space. Sounds like an exciting kickoff to this career you've had in this realm. Can you share what your work looks like day to day? Obviously, without getting too specific, so as to tip off the thieves out there.
Absolutely. So our work kind of consists of two parts. We first have what I'm going to broadly call intake, which is when people call us and we kind of see what their issues are and put in place a plan with them to help deal with them. So my last call before this one was from a dentist who has been a practice owner for about 3 years, and she noticed that her office manager was routinely writing off dental treatment that was done to the office manager's family. And the doctor's collections, according to practice management software, never seemed to line up with what goes in her bank. And there were three or four other kind of symptoms of embezzlement. So I listened to her and said, yeah, I agree with you. I think you need an investigation. Let's talk about what that looks like. And we did, and we discussed cost, and I sent her an engagement letter and agreement a few minutes before our call started. So when she signs that letter, then we need to gather some stuff from her. I mean, we will make a copy of her practice management software. We will get her bank statements and merchant statements and some other stuff. And we have an onboarding team who do that. And then once that happens, the file goes to one of our 18 investigators.
And what's
And
your role typically on a day-to-day basis? Are you
stay
personally
the heck out
involved
of
with
their way and let
cases?
them do their job mostly.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're leading, right? You're leading the practice.
Yeah, I am. I'm there when trouble happens. One of the hats I wear is called Chief Fraud Examiner, which means that I'm the go-to person when one of our investigators can't solve a problem or they're stuck somewhere in their job. I mean, I'm the person they come to, and then when they're finished with a client and they have their final report put together, I'm the person who reviews that. And behind my back, they all talk about Dave's big red pen. And that's a polite way of saying that I am incredibly fussy about our reports, because they're going to law enforcement and a prosecutor and ultimately a judge somewhere, and we need to articulate clearly and unambiguously what happened in a way that a judge who doesn't know anything about dentistry at all can understand.
Uh-huh.
So all our people come from a dental background, and one of the things they all have to do is unlearn some things they know.
Could you give us an example of one of those things?
Yeah. If you start talking about dual insurance, you know what it means. I know what it means. The chance that a 70-year-old gray-haired judge will know what dual insurance means in a dental context is just about zero.
Hmm.
So we have to explain ourselves.
Got it.
Um, this happens in technical ways, and of course we in the dental world talk to each other in a common language. There are some things that we all understand. And you can't do that here. You have to explain this to somebody who knows nothing about dentistry.
Quite a task, I'm sure. So you're leading the practice. You're basically things are escalated to you, and you maintain a quality control component to your work. It sounds like. Um, you are one of a handful of non-clinicians to be honored with a fellowship in the International Academy of Dental Facial Aesthetics. That's quite an honor. I mean, how did that come to pass? And, what did that feel like for you to receive this honor?
It's really rewarding that the dental profession has kind of treated me as one of its own. Um, and if you're a dentist, you have a lot of people looking for your attention and your money. And sometimes that I think for them can get a little bit irksome.
Uh-huh.
And I'm just incredibly honored that they've welcomed me into every part of their lives. And I have made lifelong dental friends in this profession, and have sat at really tables that are should be for dentists only, but they say, oh, come on over here and talk to us. You understand the pressures we're under and the challenges we have in our lives, and you've always met us with a empathetic understanding, and you don't judge us, and we appreciate that, and that's incredibly gratifying.
Yeah, I can imagine. And now, David, since your humble beginnings back in the end of what, 89, 90, right? Now, with over 30 years of cases behind you, what's keeping this work interesting, or even, if I may use the term, urgent for you?
We we deal with people who are at a very low point in their lives, and I mentioned that new practice owner who was my previous call before you. This person's very upset. I mean, they bought this practice. They had a picture that they would get to be the leader of a team and put their stamp on things and kind of make the practice into what they wanted to make it. And now they're kind of feeling like the tail that the dog is wagging all over the place and they can't stop it. And I think distraught might be a strong word, but this person said, yeah, I've had some sleepless nights lately, and I'm worried about this. And this is my livelihood, and I've got a family I support. So they're at this very low point, and what they're looking for from us is some technical skills, but also to take them by the hand and just say, you know what, this is going to be okay. We're going to get you back a lot of the money that was stolen from you. Um, you're going to like practicing 6 months from now a whole lot more than you do now. And we get the big exhale from them, and they say, thank you for saying that. The other thing I tell them is it's not your fault. A lot of dentists come from a culture of accountability.
Hmm.
And in the clinical sense, I'm really glad that they do. But when they extend that to running their practice, that becomes burdensome for them, and they're holding themselves to an impossibly high standard. And when I tell them that, they say, okay, somebody needed to put it that way. So in terms of what brings me joy, first of all, I love our team. We have some incredible people, not only in their technical skill, but their dedication and the caring that they bring to the problem. But what I really love is taking people at a low point and helping them make it better.
Well, it's great to be in that circle of trust. Obviously, this industry has invested in that trust with you. I'd love to take a step back here. You know, I have both of your books here, Dental Embezzlement, Art of Theft and Signs of Control, and The Healers versus Stealers, both of which I mentioned in the intro. And there are some fascinating stories in here. Before we kind of get into the heart of things, I'm hoping you can put dental fraud into some context for us. You've written that embezzlement in dentistry is both common and personal. What makes dental practices so vulnerable?
Several things. I think first of all, very few dentists chose that profession because they really, really wanted to own a business. For almost every dentist I've ever met, Kevin, they got into the profession because they wanted to help people. They wanted to be a healer. And the business part, I guess if I have to, I'll keep the place running, but that's not really my happy place.
Yeah, the
And there
reluctant
are
business owner
exceptions.
almost, right?
Reluctant business owner. I once described it as kind of the unwanted stepchild of the marriage. Um, so that's the first part. The other thing I'll say is that dentists exist in a fairly complex environment. And when I started in 1989, the first case I investigated, the dentist got paid exactly two ways: cash and check. They didn't even take credit cards. And you evolve from that to now, and the way money flows through a practice is much more complex. You've got all kinds of electronic forms of payment. You've got insurance companies paying by these horrible virtual credit cards. There are lots of ways that money moves. And you have practice management software. That old pegboard system that I was reminiscing about a few minutes ago was really simple. And I would say most dentists could understand what was going on in pegboard fairly well. Practice management software as a whole, they're animal. And I think that's been one of the big enablers of embezzlement.
Hmm.
And it's not just the flow of money that's gotten more complex. I mean, when I started, there was no OSHA, there was no HIPAA. Um, it's not just the money part of a dental practice that's gotten more complicated. Even employment laws have gotten incredibly complex in some states. And the third factor is the prevalence of dental insurance at some level makes a lot of patients indifferent as to what the total cost of their treatment is. They're now just focused on what do I have to pay? And everything else to them is just noise. So they kind of tune that out, and that creates some opportunities. In other words, there are very few businesses out there where 70% of the cost is paid for by some third party. When you or I go to buy a car, I mean, we pay for 100% of it. Maybe some of it's financed, but we see the total cost. We, react to the total cost and make our decisions on that basis. Dentistry is not like that. There's kind of this imperfect exchange of services and maybe sometimes goods for money in dentistry that you don't find in a lot of other professions.
Hmm.
So I think those are the factors, but dentistry is, and the audience needs to hear this, the most embezzled commercial activity. The two groups that get embezzled more than dentistry are government and charities.
Wow, that puts some really solid context for how serious this issue is. Let's maybe look at the other side of the coin as well. What about the people side? So, without getting technical, what's a general profile, if such a thing exists, of someone who ends up stealing from a dentist?
Unfortunately, there really is no profile. It could be somebody you hired last week, or it could be somebody who's worked for you for decades. They could be of any age, of both genders, of any ethnicity. They could go to church every Sunday or not. Um, there is really no profile in terms of demographics. Behaviorally, we can say a lot. Thieves will be take charge people. They will play to that bone that is inside every dentist, where the dentist says, "Yeah, my happy place is the operatory. Please take all this stuff off my plate so I can be a highly productive dentist." They will pander to that emotion in dentists. They will work in the office when nobody else is around, whether that's early mornings before everybody gets there, or they stay late, or they kind of slip into the office on Saturdays to clean up things. Thieves like to be alone when they steal. Um, one of my investigators said something that's always stuck with me. She said, the first casualty of embezzlement is transparency. So thieves will want some opacity about what they're doing and the finances of the practice. They may not, for example, want to discuss receivables with the doctor. So transparency falls down. Depending on how they're stealing, Kevin, they might even be reluctant to take a vacation.
Wow. Okay.
Not all thieves will fall into that category, but it is consistent with embezzlement. They are isolationist. They want to keep everybody away from the dentist. And again, a lot of dentists want a gatekeeper who will stop everybody who would like a few minutes of the doctor's time from claiming it. But in this case, the isolationism that they want to do is to keep people like consultants away.
Yeah, so they don't want any prying eyes, number 1, but for the dentist, that's gotta be a really emotional thing if you feel like this person has been your most loyal, you know, trusted person who is giving up nights, weekends, or whatever else to help run the practice, and then to find embezzlement, that's gotta be emotionally challenging, as you mentioned.
Superficially, working for the dentist and working against them don't look that different.
Mhm.
And yeah, one of the hard things for a dentist is that this person that they, think would take a bullet for them,
Mhm.
um, was actually stealing from them. That's incredibly hard.
Well, given that, right, I don't wanna say it's an abdication of responsibility, I don't necessarily wanna say it's over-trusting, but how long does the typical embezzlement go undetected given these kinds of, um, trust issues, right? And why is it so often missed by smart owners? I mean, these folks are educated, smart. Could you shed some light on that?
I sure can. The average embezzlement that we see goes on undetected for about 2 years. The average amount stolen over that 2 years is about $109,000. So 6 figures. There are outliers in both directions, and I signed off on a report the other day where happily the amount stolen was $4,000.
Mhm. Was that an
Um,
early catch or was that
it was an early catch. Yeah, it was. Every small embezzlement is just a bigger embezzlement that got caught quickly.
yeah. What's the largest embezzlement you've seen so far in your
Just about $2 million,
wow. Yeah, big numbers. So,
and that was over 6 years at a two doctor practice.
wow. Okay. Well, given that impact, what are some of the, let's say, most common behavioral red flags that you see in these fraud cases?
I think we covered some of them. Territoriality is a big one. Thieves are possessive about their duties. It might even extend, Kevin, to their workspace or their computer. I something I really hear commonly from clients is, yeah, my office manager was at lunch and somebody needed a workstation and they were all busy. So she sat at the office manager's desk and then the office manager got back from lunch and freaked out.
Hmm.
Um, and picture a situation where you are stealing, you do write down somewhere what you're doing so you can kind of navigate through the accounts later. And somebody's sitting at the desk that has the computer that has that information on it, you're not happy.
Mhm. Sure. That makes sense.
So that's one. Another one that I highlight sometimes is what I call conspicuous displays of honesty. So if you're an honest person, you don't wave it around like a flag.
Right.
You just take for granted that the whole world perceives that you're honest, and you don't need to keep bringing it up.
Mhm.
Whenever somebody wants to tell you or demonstrate to you how honest they're being, that's a big red flag. At a minimum, what they're saying to you is, well, I'm not always honest, but I'm being honest right now. And it may well extend beyond that to, I'm not even being honest right now, but I want to act like I am so that you don't feel the need to look over my shoulder.
You had mentioned 2. Are there other, let's say, top indicators, behavioral red flags that you see?
Well, I think I've covered actually more than that because I talked about the people who work extra hours and are resistant to people like consultants or maybe the doctor's CPA getting a little more involved in the practice. I mean, they really keep outsiders out. They will often over time remake the dentist group of advisors. So every dentist has this circle of people around them who help them with stuff. And it might be their accountant, it might be their IT person, it might be the dental supply rep who's selling things to the practice. A lot of times the thief will um, replace the people that were there initially with their own people. So, doctor, the every time I call the IT guys, I have to wait 2 weeks for them to get back to me. But you know what? I know another great IT firm. Let me get them in here. And we're buying our stuff from Patterson, and we're really overpaying for supplies. But I know somebody at Shine, and I'll bring them in. And it's not necessarily, Kevin, that these people are complicit in stealing or anything like that. I'm not suggesting that in the slightest. What replacing those people with the embezzlers team does, though, is it creates a transference of loyalty. So now, if that Henry Schein rep who's getting paid commission because the practice is buying from them, and the only reason that happened was because the practice's office manager made the doctor make the switch. If all that happens, and I'm that Henry Schein person, and I have some concern about the practice, I'm going right to the office manager with it. There's no way I'm going to go around that person to the dentist with my concerns. So what somebody does when they remake the team in that way, and this happens over years. I mean, this is not a weekend activity. But they end up with a bunch of people advising the practice whose primary loyalty is to the thief.
That makes sense.
The chance that any of those people are going to go to the doctor and say, I have concerns about your office manager is exactly zero.
Right. Right.
So that's another behavioral activity that we see.
Well, let's maybe flip the script here a little bit. Are there any types of dentists or leadership styles that tend to create an environment with more risk?
Certainly, the dentist who is the abdicator, and you used that word a minute ago, and I want to come back to it because I talk a lot about the difference between delegation and abdication. And in my construction of those terms, delegation is I'm giving you this job to do. I'm going to watch you as you do it at some level, which doesn't mean micromanagement, but I'm going to expect and enforce accountability from you. And I'm also going to invest the mental effort in understanding what I've delegated to you well enough that I can see whether you're discharging your responsibilities or not. So delegation is work. We think of delegation as handing work to people, and that's true, but there's also work in maintaining the accountability. And a lot of dentists will say, I hold my people accountable, but it's a theoretical and not a practical accountability. And the other side of it is abdication. And abdication is when I say, I'm giving you this job to do, and I don't ever want to hear about it again. And there is a whole lot of abdication in dental practices when really delegation would be appropriate. Um, just a really stupid basic example of this is most dentists have social media pages. Whenever you set up a social media page, you have to put kind of the owner of the page. And in about 98% of the situations that we encounter, the owner of that page is a person other than the dentist in the practice.
Yeah, why is that? Is that due to they don't want to be exposed from a liability perspective, or they're really just abdicating because they want
No,
somebody else to take
it's
care of
that
it?
the dentist didn't set up the page. Let's say it's the office Facebook account, for example. The dentist doesn't personally set it up. It's some staff member, and they just naturally put their contact information there. And the dentist doesn't tell them. And when you set up that social media page, I need to be the primary party on that page.
Hmm.
And then what happens is this person gets fired or quits or something, and they're still the owner of the page.
Right.
And if their firing is adversarial, now they have a weapon in their hands. There was a dentist in Indiana who fired a staff member who was the administrator on the Facebook page. And what that staff member did was put a notice up on the Facebook page that the office would be closed while Dr. So-and-so dealt with his narcotics addiction.
Oh my gosh.
There was no addiction. The office was not in fact closed, but you can just close your eyes and picture that
Oh yeah.
the dollar amount of damage that caused.
Unbelievable.
So let's differentiate between I'm giving you responsibilities temporarily because no staff member is permanent, and I'm going to hold you accountable, and I'm also going to have the ability to take control over whatever activity I've given you versus here, you just look after this and set up our Facebook page for us. And unfortunately, a lot of dentists just can't differentiate those two very well in terms of what they should be doing when.
Well, you've highlighted some examples here that sort of point to this point that there's a lot of psychological and not just financial damage in this realm of fraud and embezzlement. And I think I recall reading in your book here, you've said that embezzlement is more psychological than financial. Could you explain what you mean by that?
A lot of dentists have said to me over the years, the money that I've lost from this, I'll get some back from insurance, I'll get some back from the thief, whether I get 100% back of what was stolen or 60% depends. Um, Whatever I lost, I have the option to adjust my practice style to recover that. So, I can add a half an hour to my day, to my schedule every day if that's what it takes. The financial part they have some control over. What causes the damage that is long term and I think in a lot of cases a lot worse is the emotional damage that this causes to the practice. And case in point, 2 weeks ago, I was having dinner with a client of ours. So this is somebody we've done 2 investigations for. She's lost $280,000 probably to the thief. And she was saying to me at dinner, yeah, I am about to sell my practice to a DSO. And she's run an a very successful independent practice for a long time. She's a very smart lady. She's probably an excellent clinical dentist. And I asked her the elephant in the room question when I said, Is it because of what's happened to you with the embezzlement?" And the backstory, Kevin, this office manager worked for her for about 20 years.
Oh, wow.
My client thought she had it made. This was a take charge, run the place kind of office manager. Let the dentist be a clinical dentist. And yeah, it was $283,000, I think. I don't think my client's that worried about the money. I mean, she she has a good practice. She does well. But it was the violation of her trust that really is what's weighing on her. And she just said to me, I don't want to be a business owner anymore. So, she gave me the names of a couple of DSOs that she's been talking to, and she said, "Yeah, I'm gonna sell the practice to one of them because I want to get out of the business of being in business."
Yeah, that's sounds like a real breach of trust, one, but secondly, sort of shattering this concept of um shatters your peace, right? Your peace of mind as a practice owner. And now she's always going to be looking over her shoulder for whoever she brings in. And that's a really hard place to operate from.
Yeah, and I think really what she said is, I don't want to be looking over my shoulder, so I'm going to sell to somebody who 5 years ago I probably would have described as the Antichrist. Um, and I'm not anti DSO, but I think 5 years ago she would have been. And she said, I'm gonna do what I would have found unthinkable a few years back, but I just don't feel emotionally equipped anymore to be a dental practice owner, so I'm going to sell. Um, so that's kind of a tragedy at some level. I mean, this lady was is a good dentist, and I think other than this one episode, has done really well at a lot of things like marketing and putting a good team in place and doing good dental work for patients who love her.
Mhm. Well, you talk about in Healers versus Stealers about, not hiring embezzlers as, you know, some certainly some tips on how to hire, good folks and some controls to put in place. I really wanna talk for a minute about this wall of shame that you have on Prosperident's website. That's a very interesting website. I spent some time looking at these, faces and what have you. How did that get started, and why does it exist? Pretty bold in doing that, if I may say.
Somebody has said to us over the years, more than once, why isn't there a centralized place where we can go to look to see if the person we're about to hire has the kind of track record that should frighten the hell out of us? And I got asked that question many times. Well, why doesn't my state dental association keep track of these people? And the answer, of course, is potential liability. And any not-for-profit organization like that has to be concerned about what they might put on those sites. And also, of course, they're dealing with indirect information. I mean, we put these people there because we catch them, and we know the accuracy of the information that's on the site. So this is part of our website. Our website is prosperident.com, and it's a top menu item, Hall of Shame, and we have about 800 embezzlers who have a permanent home there. And we of course have tried to put as much information as we can that would help somebody who's looking at hiring these people. So we put pictures because, of course, some embezzlers will change their name. They'll revert to their name pre-marriage or something like that. Some of them have even done a legal name change because they think it will be that much harder to connect them with their baggage. Um, and we put birth dates and as much of the immutable stuff as we can, so that if somebody is looking at that website and see somebody they recognize, that they can understand what that person has done in the past to other dentists.
Mhm. Well, I understand now the importance of having that central place, so appreciate your thoughts on that. Maybe what we do is shift focus here a little bit, David, to talk about how we prevent some of these challenging opportunities for fraud. Your book, Dental Embezzlement, talks about the science of control. You emphasize that, fraud prevention is not a one-time fix, but it's a discipline, a continual set of behavior systems and checks. Could you share some examples of controls or routines maybe that help minimize risk without creating a sense of paranoia?
Absolutely. And the first thing I'll say is there's a lot of good information in a doctor's practice management software to protect them. And unfortunately, a lot of doctors don't realize that, or don't know how to get at it, or think it will take them an inordinate amount of time and they ignore it. So let's start with the most basic control. And the most basic control is that at the end of each day, your office manager needs to print a day end report. This is a recap that every software has that says, here's the clinical work we did today, and here's how much patients paid us, and here are the adjustments we made. So they need to take that and match it to the bank deposit. This is a staff job, not a doctor job. The doctor is going to do a parallel process, but that basic day end balancing needs to happen in every single office. And when I started in this game, I mean, it was just mandatory. I see a surprising number of offices now where the staff don't do that, and the doctor doesn't realize that it isn't being done, or even doesn't realize that it needs to be done, or even worse, doesn't realize that it isn't being done. And that's kind of fallen by the boards. And that will catch really basic mistakes like, a check goes into the deposit, but a payment wasn't entered into the patient's account. In other words, this is not completely an anti-embezzlement process, but it's just a really basic financial control. Um, From the doctor side, what you need to do is a couple of things. One is you need to look at that day-end report that comes from your software. And I'm gonna escalate this slightly and say, and you need to print it yourself. In other words, do not allow a staff member to print and hand you a report that you rely on because you didn't have control over how that report was constructed. And it's really easy to do something called selective reporting where you think you're looking at a complete report and in fact you're not. Uh,
Interesting.
so print the report yourself and ask yourself two questions. The first question is what I'm seeing consistent with what I remember happened today? And Kevin, being a smart man, you will know that I used the word today in there. In other words, doing this a week later is pointless. You need to do it today before you go home. Does it make sense? And is it consistent with what I remember from today? But it doesn't make sense. The kind of thing I mean is if you're looking at a hygienist's work and you have this idea that patients should get radiographs annually. Well, if you're looking at a hygienist who saw 10 patients today, there should be somewhere between 4 and 5 and 6 sets of film today. If you look at today and there are 2 sets of film, okay, maybe that's a sampling error. In other words, we're dealing with a small sample. If you look at the whole week or the whole month and you're not seeing the number of radiographs that you think you should, there's a problem. Maybe the hygienist is not being diligent about updating people's radiography, or even worse, maybe the films are being taken and for whatever reason, they just aren't getting billed to patients and insurance companies. So that's what I want a doctor to do at the end of each day. I always tell doctors, don't try to follow the money daily from collections to your bank account. That activity is way better done on a monthly basis. Um, but really basic controls are getting comfortable with your practice management software, learning how to print reports, and then actually printing them and reading them. And the doctor, there aren't a whole lot of reports the doctor needs to look at. I mean, I was looking at one type of practice management software the other day, and it is capable of generating 113 different reports.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a lot.
Maybe 5 of those are relevant to the doctor.
Yeah.
The staff might use another 20, and I have no idea what happens to the, other 90 odd reports.
Yeah. I've talked to a number of different dentists and, subspecialties, orthodontics and what have you. They have multiple locations. What would you say to the doctor who has multiple locations? This dentist is not able to put eyes on all those reports, or should that be coming through some centralized control where they can?
Um, 2 things I'll say, and the first one applies to a solo office or a multiple office. Every provider should be required at the end of each day to sign off on their report. In other words, if I'm a hygienist in one of your 5 practices, I should get handed a report at the end of today by the site manager who says, review it, and if you're happy with it, sign it. And then they take that report away. In other words, every provider should have accountability for what happens in their operatory. If it's a dental operatory, I like to see both the dentist in that operatory and their assistant sign off. Yeah, this is what happened today. Obviously, they can't sign off on how much patients paid or things like that. I mean, that happens at the front desk. But to just confirm, yes, this is the work I did today, is a good starting point. And that applies again if it should apply in my own operatory. It should apply in an associate I have, and if I have 5 practices, every provider should be attesting to this is what they did today. Beyond that, Kevin, when you get too busy to do it yourself, it still has to happen in terms of financial oversight. So there should be, if you have 5 practices, there should be somebody who sits in an office somewhere, and one of their big jobs is to get reports for each of your practices, and again, print them yourself. Don't let the office manager in your Arlington office send in a report. We need remote access. We get it ourselves, and then compare what was collected with what is recorded in the software, and also to review the software to look for weird stuff.
Great.
And we could spend hours talking about what constitutes weird stuff,
I
but
bet we could.
you know,
Yeah.
transactions on a Saturday when the office is closed would be an example of weird stuff.
Mhm. Well, we talked about sort of this multi-site owner. Let's maybe go back to a small team. Is there such a thing as, quote, too much trust in a small team environment?
Oh yeah. And as humans, the way that we handle the question of trust is kind of interesting. When you first meet somebody, I mean, the first time you and I met, this subconscious question that we each ask is, well, can I trust this person? I mean, as humans, we do that all the time, and it could be that you're at the corner store buying an ice cream, but as humans, we intuitively ask the trust question, which is good. The problem is that when we get an answer, then we lock it up in a closet. We never bring it out again. So I meet you and I decide I can trust you. That's, for most people, a lifelong decision. In other words, we ask it once and it has no expiry date.
Interesting observation. Yeah.
Um, and in some contexts, that's fine. The problem with doing that with your team is that they may be completely trustworthy today, and then something happens to them next week or next year, and they're no longer trustworthy. But because you viewed it as a one-time decision, you're not ever going into that closet and saying, I know that I decided I could trust this person in 2022, but do they still warrant that level of trust? I mean, if somebody does something really blatant to you, then the trust is broken and you know that. So, your neighbor throws dog poop at your front door. Okay, we won't trust them anymore. Um, if they're
It's
caught
not
on
usually
camera,
that obvious, right?
but it's not usually that blatant. And somebody who doesn't really deserve your trust anymore is concurrently doing a lot of things to convince you that they're still trustworthy. We're just not that good though at opening that closet and looking in it and saying, okay, I know I decided to trust them in 2022, but does it, is that still a good decision?
Well, so let's pick at that for a second, David. So, if you're speaking to practice leaders in our audience right now, what advice would you give them as to how to balance a positive office culture, which we hear so much about, and this reality that this oversight is still necessary? Do you have any tips for that?
I will quote one of my clients who got embezzled for a lot of money. And I asked him afterwards, what did you learn from this? Like, what are you doing differently now than you were before you got stolen from? And he said something I thought was really profound. He said, what I have learned is that I should trust systems, not people.
Mhm.
And I think the reality for most dental practices is that the only barrier between the dentist and being stolen from is the honesty of staff. In other words, there are a lot of dental offices where staff could steal if they chose to, and maybe so far they haven't made that choice. But one thing I know from my 35 years in this business is that everybody's ethics are pliable under some amount of pressure. And that threshold is different for different people. But if I'm a practice owner and I have 10 staff, the chance that sooner or later one of those staff is going to have a money problem and they're going to view stealing from me as the appropriate solution is pretty high.
Oh, so I think you've talked about this challenge, right, of balancing trust and controls accountability, this belief in systems. But I think a lot of practice owners probably carrying some big myths around with them. What do you think the biggest myth is that practice owners believe about their own financial safety or the operation of their practice? What's the biggest myth they have?
They believe that they are better judges of other people's character than they really are.
Interesting.
That I can tell when I'm interviewing somebody to hire them whether they're honest or not. And it's kind of like those studies they do every few years, when they take 1,000 people and they say, rate yourself as a driver. Are you below average, average, or above average? And about 70% of people consistently rate themselves as above average drivers. And I can tell you categorically in my city that's not true. I mean, it's a mathematical impossibility to start with, and then second, my practical experience just doesn't reinforce that. I think it's the same with how good a judge of people we are. I think most people think they're above average at that, and it's not true. Um,
I know, again, healers versus stealers, there's a lot in this book, but a book isn't everything, right? I mean, I think there's a lot, certainly a really good read, and I found it very fascinating. I'm sure any practice leader would. But when do you, as a practice owner, pick up the phone and call in the experts like you, David? When should they pick up the phone and call in experts like yourself?
I'd say the first time is when their gut instinct is telling them something is wrong, and a lot of the clients we investigate for, had this chronic problem. There were clear symptoms that something was not right, and they kind of tried to tune that out. Sometimes it's a stronger faith in humanity than they probably should have had. Sometimes they were so dependent on the person that was stealing that they just couldn't contemplate trying to replace them and, get somebody at the same level. Sometimes they think that the value of this person to the practice is greater than the amount they steal, which I call the metaphor of the ledger. But they, for whatever reason, they tuned it out. So their spidey sense was tingling, and they chose to ignore it. Um, if you think there's a possibility that somebody's stealing, I really want to talk to you. And we may end that conversation saying, I think I understand your concerns, but they don't really sound like stealing. They sound like a staff competence issue, or maybe there's a leadership issue in your practice. There's something other than stealing. That may be how the conversation ends, but I don't think you will ever regret reaching out to an expert if you have enough sense that something's not right. Um, the second time is when people are acting out. And as you and I have talked about in this time together, there are definite behavioral manifestations of stealing. And when you see those things, I think as a practice owner, you need to react. The third time is when there are financial anomalies in your practice. And the financial anomalies could be things like your collections consistently don't line up with your bank deposits, or you're 20% busier this year, but it's really not showing up in your bank account. Or, you have a whole bunch of adjustments that you don't understand on those daily reports that I'm telling you to look at. And you ask people and you get sort of obfuscatory answers. I mean, thieves are really good at spinning their dentists. So you ask a question and you sort of walk away from that conversation knowing less than when you started. Those are all times to reach out to an expert.
I recently had on the show a multi-site owner, fast growing, 8, soon to be 10 locations. How does embezzlement look different in DSOs or these multi-site groups? Could you talk a little bit about how that manifests?
Yeah, I'd love to. And let's differentiate between really big DSOs like Heartland or Aspen or Pacific Dental, that have been around for a while and have a mature kind of system of controls in place. They still get embezzled from, and I mean, some of those people are our clients, and theft is not something that they have managed to um stop at all. They haven't, and big DSOs get stolen from as well. Smaller DSOs or multi-site practices are particularly vulnerable, and the reason, Kevin, is that their revenue grows a lot faster than their control systems. You start with that charismatic dentist who runs a really good practice and, gets the idea that, well, I can sort of replicate this in a couple of other practices, and pretty soon they have 3 or 5 or 8 practices. but their focus is always on the next one, the acquisition. Uh, and not so much how do I run the 7 that I already have? That kind of takes a back seat until something bad happens and, they then at that point they sort of get locked on it. But their control systems tend to be weak. If they're growing by acquisition, they also are um, really complicating the management structure. I was talking to one multi-practice owner who owned 12 practices, and he said, "Yeah, I've got 4 different practice management softwares running in my 12 practices." Because he was buying practices, and each time he bought a practice, he had this decision to make about, do I throw away the practice management software that's there, which A, costs money, and B, is likely to prompt a staff revolt? Or do I just sort of try to fold it into my management structure somehow? But, trying to aggregate the information from 4 different softwares. He said, if my bank asks me, like, how much are your total receivables? I mean, somebody's got to spend 3 or 4 hours to get to the bottom of that. Um, so that it is. The other thing with theft is that every thief needs to rationalize. We all learned on the playground that you don't take other people's things. I mean, that's not a radical concept for any human. So every thief needs to be able to say that I know that in general it's wrong to steal, but it's okay in this situation because. And what I want every multi-practice owner, every DSO executive to hear is that it's a lot easier to justify stealing when the person signing your paycheck you've never met.
Yeah, depersonalizes that, right?
It sure does. And the bigger you get, the easier it is for somebody to say they're never going to miss it.
Well, let's maybe pick at that a bit. What are some unique risks for investors or PE firms that are acquiring practices that, weren't either previously well managed or they had few controls? What did the risks look like for those stepping in the acquisition side of things?
The big risk for a lot of private equity investing in dentistry is they don't know what they don't know. Um, I mean, when I go to DSO conferences, I'm a guy who's spent my whole life in dentistry. I talk to dentists all day. I have a love for that profession. And I'd like to think some understanding of what happens in a dental practice. And you go to DSO conferences and they're not talking about dentistry. They're talking about investment and same store sales and, how can we cut costs here? Or how can we optimize our revenue cycle? And you realize that the people pulling the strings don't really care about dentistry, may understand it at only a superficial level. I mean, for all they care, dental practices could be making hamburgers. The questions they have are, what sort of return can I get on my investment? What upside can I get realized here? And is this thing recession proof? And if they like the answers to those 3 questions, their money goes in. But there's a danger when as you progress up the food chain, the understanding of the core business gets progressively smaller.
Well, let's flip that on its head then. Let me give you a scenario, David. See if you could help shed some light here. I am a let's say I'm a dentist, have 3 locations. I've been in practice for 25 years. My daughter is not looking to take over the practice from me. She's going on to do other things. I'm looking ahead to maybe selling my practice. I'm, let's say, 2 years out. I think I'm 2 years out from that decision. What do I start doing now as it relates to making sure things are clean, making sure that I'm not being stolen from? What advice would you have for that dentist in that situation?
That is a great time to involve somebody like us to do an audit.
Mhm.
Um,
What does
and
that look like? Yeah. Uh,
well, it looks like our looking in your financial records and predominantly your financial or your practice management software to see if somebody has their hand on your wallet. And if we find that, which statistically we probably will in 20% of practices,
Wow, yeah, that's a high number.
what just happened is the value of your practice went up.
Mhm.
In other words, you're 2 years out, you're looking at selling to a DSO, you're likely to go to a practice broker or somebody who values practices and say, here are my metrics, what's my practice worth? So let's say we find that in the last 2 years, somebody has stolen $150,000 from you. Now, when you go to that practice broker, you're going to say, when you calculate my EBITDA, which is the earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, which is the yardstick that everybody like a DSO uses. When you calculate my EBITDA, you're going to do normalization adjustments. In other words, you're going to back out the salary that I actually paid myself and you're going to replace it with a fair market salary for my work as a dentist. You're going to back out the vacation that I took to the Caribbean and I wrote off as a continuing education. There's this whole exercise of getting from actual results to what a purchaser would be looking at. And one of the things that I want you to normalize, Mr. Practice Broker, is the $150,000 that I lost over the last 2 years for embezzlement. And here's Prosperident's report that confirms that. And the practice broker will say correctly, yeah, that makes total sense. You've identified this loss and you've dealt with it, so I will put it back into your EBITDA. And what that means is when you go to sell that practice, a multiple of 5 to 1 or 8 to 1 for EBITDA is not uncommon. So if we find $75,000 a year for you, we just increase your purchase price by something north of $500,000.
And likewise, do you find that somebody going to sell their practice, if they provide a clean audit statement, that might help them get a better multiple? Or, what's your observation there?
That's obviously up to the broker doing it, but my suggestion would be that, one of the factors in EBITDA is risk. And risk being defined as really what you don't know. And if you take embezzlement off the table, the risk went down. And yeah, my view is that warrants a higher EBITDA. Will every broker see it that way? Probably not. But the good news is there are multiple brokers out there. So if somebody doesn't, look around. It's kind of like Kevin, the practice that goes to sell and they have 2 years left on their premises lease versus the practice that has 10 years on their lease.
Right.
The practice with 10 years left on their lease presents lower risk because there's not going to be a renegotiation with the landlord in 2 years that might increase the rent by 30%. And as a practice owner, if you take risks off the table, and a good friend of mine runs a company that specializes in lease negotiation for dentists, and he says, if you're thinking of selling the practice, one of the best things you can do for a practice value is go back to your landlord now and negotiate a long-term extension to your lease.
Great advice.
So I'll say the same thing for embezzlement risk and financial risk. Take it off the table for a buyer, and yeah, your practice is more desirable. So that would be one piece of advice I give. There are probably others, but that's a pretty good one.
Well, you've got a lot of stories in your book. I wish we could continue talking for hours. I would love to see if I could tease out a unique story for our audience. Can you share any horror stories of deals gone wrong or deals
Oh
gone
yeah,
sideways due to unidentified fraud?
yeah, I sure can. Um, hmm. This isn't particularly a deal story, but I think it's one that the audience might get a little chuckle out of. I got a call one day from somebody who said, I'm an orthodontist in whatever, and he gave the name of the state. And he said, I'm in 50-50 partnership with another orthodontist. And we have this unwritten rule where when patients pay us in cash, we just put it in our pockets and we don't tell the IRS. So he kind of started like this, and I'm thinking, okay, where's this going? And it was what he said next that kind of sat me on the floor when he said, "And the reason I'm calling you, David, is that I think my partner is stealing more than I am." And it's not often I'm rendered speechless, but I just couldn't form a word or a coherent thought when he said this. When I got my composure back, I said, "Okay, we'll have a look at this," and we did. The differential between them was about $300,000.
Yeah.
So his partner had taken 300,000 more in cash than this guy did.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of the most artistically written reports we ever delivered because we had to step around this big elephant in the room called tax evasion.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, he was right. So one thing that dentists struggle with, they understand that their staff in the right set of circumstances might steal from them. But a brother or sister dentist who shares their same ethics, who, maybe was their classmate in dental school, they just cannot accept that. But I'll give you some numbers on this. So we typically have around 110 open cases at any point in time. So that's what we're working on today.
Wow.
Of that 110, roughly somewhere between 10 and 14 or 15 of them will be what we call fratricide cases. Fratricide meaning from Latin to kill one's brother. And what we call a fratricide case is where the person suspected is a dentist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a report I'm going to write this afternoon is from an interesting situation. So we have two dentists who each owned a practice of their own. And then they decided to set up one together. And the next thing they did was combine things like the purchasing because they could get bigger discounts when they bought for three practices than when they
Right.
bought for one. So what was happening a lot was the practice they set up together was buying stuff for all three practices.
Okay.
One of the dentists in that combined practice eventually bought the other one out, and the one who was bought out has now decided that probably a lot of things were run through that combined practice that pertain to the other dentist and not to the one who was bought out. And the number that the dentist who was bought out has come up with is over $500,000.
Wow. Okay.
The dentist who did the buying has hired me. Actually, her attorney has hired me to now look at this and see if that number's right. And it's radically wrong. I mean, I'd be surprised if it was $40,000. It's a lot smaller. But the point is, these two got into a practice together, and one of them was running the finances, and the other one felt like the person running the finances was abusing that rule, and that the dollars were big. So there's a lot of stuff that happens between dentists, and we end up getting brought into it to see what really happened.
Well, there's big numbers. My question for you, you mentioned being hired by an attorney. And I know that, there's a lot of times attorney client privilege comes with that when you hire an outside agent or auditor or what have you under, um, through a lawyer. About what percentage of your clients come to you through an attorney versus come to you as an individual and practice owner?
If you suspect that one of your staff is stealing from you, you don't need an attorney. You should be able to hire us directly, and the legal work that's going to be done in that case is going to be done by a prosecutor, so a district attorney or conceivably a United States attorney if it's a federal matter. And those folks are paid for by all the taxpayers, not by you specifically. So if you think it's embezzlement, don't waste your attorney's time. Don't run up bills with your attorney. They really have no additional value to add in most cases. If you're in a contractual dispute, so you bought a practice from somebody and you realize that what they told you about the practice is different than the truth, for example, you absolutely need an attorney for that. And, that's going to be settled by lawsuit, not by a criminal process. And you need your own attorney for that. And typically they would hire us.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, we deal with a lot of that. Some of it's called buyer's remorse. And we got hired yesterday by somebody who bought a practice and now is very convinced that things like the number of new patients per month were wildly inaccurate.
Okay. Hmm.
And our job will be to look at the practice information, mostly practice management software in this case, and establish what really happened. I mean, how many new patients was the practice getting a month? The doctor who bought it was told 100. He thinks the real number is more like 30.
How many times, or what percentage of your business is, let's call it post-transaction due diligence that should have been pre-transaction due diligence? Any thoughts there?
A lot. And one of the questions I ask in a case like that I am flabbergasted by the answers is, did you do a chart on it before you bought?
Hmm.
Did you look at charts? Did you look at the practice management software? Well, no. The broker gave me some information and I relied on that to make my decision. That doesn't make it okay to misrepresent. I mean, it doesn't matter if you don't do any due diligence when you buy a practice. Misrepresenting to you is never okay.
Right.
But, wouldn't it be easier to take a little more critical look at the practice before you bought it as opposed to having to deal with this stuff later?
Yeah, exactly.
So
Prevention is an ounce of prevention, right? It's
an ounce of prevention, and the problem too is that every practice purchase almost has advisors. You have a lawyer, you have an accountant, you have maybe a consultant or somebody looking at the practice. And they look at certain things, but that doesn't mean that you have complete coverage of the issue. So your lawyer's due diligence, for example, would be making sure that if somebody's got an incorporated company or a C corp or an S corp or an LLC that's selling the practice, is it properly incorporated? Did it pass the resolution of its board of directors that it needs to sell the practice to you? So they're dealing with stuff like that. They're not asking themselves, is this a good deal or not? Is the financial information accurate? Their question is, um, are the legal constructions in place so that the company that's selling you the practice can validly sell it to you? They want to make sure that that the employees of the practice that you're buying aren't unionized, which I know sounds far fetched, but that's one of the things they look at. Um, your bank is not looking for fraud in the accounts. What your bank is looking for is, does this practice make enough money that we're comfortable that our loans will get paid back? I've had a number of people say to me, well, the bank looked at it and, they wouldn't have given me the loan if they didn't think it was a good deal. No, that's not what the bank's doing.
right.
The bank's concern is really selfish. Can you pay this back? We don't care if you're overpaying. As long as you can pay us back, we're good. And what the accountant looks at is some other stuff. It's very easy to have holes in due diligence because there tends not to be an overall quarterback who says, okay, we need to cover this and this and this and this. Lawyer, you do this. Accountant, you do this. Consultant, you do this. Bank, you do that.
And so you frequently play a role in that type of.
We don't.
You don't? Okay.
And if somebody comes to me and says, before I close on this, I want you to do an audit to make sure there's no embezzlement happening, I say don't. If you have embezzlement concerns, the day to hire us is the day after you close, because we don't want you to give ammunition to the seller to ask you for a higher price because you found embezzlement.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, I had somebody ask me that question this week. Should I do an audit before I buy it? And I said, don't you dare.
Hmm.
We need the right wording in your agreement with the other side. But if you find embezzlement, you want to find it the day after you buy, not the day before. So it's all about timing.
Fascinating. That's a fascinating perspective. I think we've probably scared every dental student out there that may be listening, may
Yeah, sorry, guys.
no, this is great, and I I think there's a lot of value here, David, in what you've shared with us. I do wanna talk to that dental student or maybe a new owner, right, who's building a practice, starting out on their own. What advice would you give to them, dental student, new owner, building a practice, about how to build a fraud-resistant practice from day one?
Well, at the risk of giving some very self-serving advice, buy my book and read it. And the bigger one that you held up, which is called Healers versus Stealers, is probably the book I'd recommend for most people. Yeah, that one. Buy that, read it, understand it. Start there. Accept and embrace the concept that you are a business owner who happens to be a dentist, as opposed to a dentist who sort of needs to find the time somewhere in their schedule, maybe possibly this month, to look at some business stuff. Um, and I say to dentists, if you don't want the burdens of ownership, and I tell dentists that, in terms of time, you need to spend 15 to 20 minutes a day and a couple of hours each month. If you hear that and you say, I don't want to do that, that's fine, but accept right now that you probably should look for some career path in dentistry that does not involve being a business owner. And you have lots of choices. I mean, you can put on a uniform and serve your country, as both Kevin and I did. You can work for an FQHC. You can teach at a school. You can work for a DSO. There are lots of great career paths for dentists that don't involve practice ownership. And I think, unfortunately, we kind of sell to dental school students the American dream, and which is get out of school, work as an associate for a couple of years, and then buy a practice, because that's what everybody should do. And I think that's a huge disservice. One of the pieces of advice that I'll give a dental student or somebody who's an associate contemplating ownership is have a little bit of honest introspection. Am I prepared to make the time and emotional commitments to being a practice owner? And if the answer is no, just say that now. I have seen, and I'm sure Kevin, you have as well, a lot of people who bought a practice because that was the thing you did. And then they got in there and they said, oh my God, people need me to make decisions. I have to fire people. I have to hire people. And I find all those things really stressful. Why didn't somebody tell me beforehand, maybe this isn't the career path for you? Well, I'm telling you now. Um, if that isn't your jam, that's fine. It doesn't mean you're a failure as a dentist or a human being. It just means that you're honest enough to say, my interest in dentistry lie in somewhere other than owning practices. That's the real advice I give people, and it's hard advice.
Well, it's great advice, and that's what we're after here on Doc Secret is sort of getting down to the nitty-gritty of things, and we appreciate you pulling back the curtain of that, today, David, so thank you. David, we wrap up all of our shows here with a lightning round. These are quick
Oh
questions
no,
designed for quick answers. First thing that
he
comes to
wants me
mind.
to think on my feet now.
That's it. That's it. Are you ready?
Well, no, but I think you're going to do it anyway.
That's right. I am. So let's get to it. David, what is one word that describes most embezzlers you've investigated?
Creative.
Hmm. What's the biggest financial red flag in Dentrix reports?
Um, Collections not lining up with deposits.
Okay. Should a dentist ever reconcile their own books?
Um, Daily. Well, let's say monthly.
Okay.
They should always, and the frequency should be monthly.
Great. What is one book that has had a significant impact on you personally or professionally?
Catch Me If You Can.
Nice.
um,
Great
which
movie.
is the story of Frank Abagnale, who was the guy who was a thief and turned his life around. And I was also a thief and like to think turned my life around. And that book really showed me that you can do this.
That's a great recommendation. Been your favorite forensic case that you've ever worked on?
Whew. I'm gonna pass on that one because I've had hundreds, and there's a little piece of my emotions and psyche in every one of them.
I can appreciate that.
Um, I like people more than cases.
Uh-huh.
And I've bonded with many of the people that we've worked with.
Mhm. Fair enough. What is one principle every practice owner should live by?
I quoted it before. It came from one of my clients: trust systems, not people.
Great advice. Well, Mr. David Harris, it has been an honor and a pleasure to have you share your wisdom with us here on Doc Secret. Thank you so much for being on the program. Really appreciate it.
I enjoyed every minute of talking with you, Kevin, and thank you for doing this.
Thanks so much. If you liked today's episode, please like and subscribe, and most importantly, share this podcast with others you think may benefit from the Doc Secrets shared here today. Thanks for joining us on today's episode, and we'll see you next time.